Now, in very simple terms, trade is just business scaled up. It's buying, it's selling, it's trying to make a profit, trying to prevent a loss. But the way in which the UK is going to trade with the rest of the world is going to fundamentally change when we leave the EU, whenever that happens. What makes this conversation particularly difficult at the moment is that we don't actually know what our future trade relationship with the EU, or indeed with the rest of the world, will be, and we probably won't know that until at least the 29th of March, if not considerably later than that. One thing I want you to pay special attention to during this special is my use of the word free, which I will use many times in lots of different contexts, and it will mean different things, and it almost certainly never means without cost. I've said before that many of the architects of Brexit believe in free market economics, which is a very pure form of capitalism where you take away all barriers to trade, all tariffs, all customs, etc., and you just allow supply and demand to regulate the market. In a free market utopia, there would basically be no borders when it came to commerce, no regulation imposed by governments. Everything would be driven by the consumer, and that would make companies and countries dynamic, effective, and competitive in order to meet customer demand. Now, you don't need me to tell you that that basically doesn't exist in modern capitalism, because governments regulate in lots of ways, whether that's minimum wage or health and safety law, all of these ways to prevent the excesses which are inherent in a free market economic model. One of the reasons that free marketeers object to the EU so much is because they feel that the EU has put excessive burdens on countries and companies when it comes to things like workers' rights, health and safety, and that makes them uncompetitive and less profitable. Equally, our membership of the EU restricts the way in which we trade with all countries in the world, and free marketeers are keen not only to throw off the regulatory burdens that come with our EU membership, but also want to completely change the way in which we trade. Now, you could see trade as collaborative, as free marketeers do, as kind of cosy and cuddly, and everyone getting along together, or you could see it in terms of competition, and countries being isolationist or protectionist, but certainly competitive. And the way in which countries might protect their interests or favour their own goods over foreign goods would be to put up things like tariffs and customs duties that make different products more attractive to the consumer because of their cost. The World Trade Organization exists to set something of a level playing field where all countries agree that the baseline for trading in, let's say, bananas is a tariff of X when you are importing from one country to another, to make it fairer. The thing is, WTO tariffs are quite high, especially on agricultural products. So if I'm exporting bananas and I don't want to pay 15% when I send them to the USA, for example, then we can have a little deal, me and the USA, and we'll agree to pay less. This is a free trade agreement where two countries will decide a mutually beneficial arrangement for their goods, their services, whatever it might be. It's not free, it's freer than the WTO tariffs. One step better than a free trade agreement is a single market where all of the countries within a group decide to have the same regulations, the same standards, the same laws applicable to goods and services in order that there's no friction of trade at all. And 10 points to Gryffindor if you've noticed that we are already in a single market where we have agreed with the European Union and 27 other member states to have common regulations over everything, free movement of goods, labour and capital in order to facilitate that market. So in part one we did a bit of theory and touched on our current trade relationship with the EU and the rest of the world. And what I want to do in part two is imagine that we achieve one of Theresa May's red lines to have an independent trade policy from the EU and what that could look like. Now the reason I say independent is because the nature of our future relationship with the EU will entirely dictate the freedom with which we have to negotiate trade deals with third countries. The closer we are to the single market, the less freedom we have. Just a quick reminder on the issue of the backstop, that if the UK is no longer in regulatory alignment with the European Union, i.e. in the single market or in a customs union, then there will be different customs regulations on either side which would need a hard border. That's the problem. So let's imagine that the Alternative Arrangements Group thinks that the only way around the backstop issue is for the UK to remain part of the single market, a model a bit like Norway. This would mean that the UK would be unable to negotiate its own third country trade deals with the rest of the world. This is just one of the rules of the single market, that if you are a member, you're benefiting from all of that lovely tariff-free trade, all of that freedom of movement, to capital, and therefore you trade as a bloc, not as an individual country. Or we could end up with Labour's plan, which is to have a permanent customs union with the EU, which is very similar to the relationship it currently has with Turkey. Now, I'm going to point you to an article which explains all of the Turkey relationship in detail, but I'm then going to go through it a bit. So you could say that Turkey has a semi-detached relationship with the EU, where through its customs union, a lot of its agricultural and other products have preferential access to the EU's single market, but it is not in the single market as such. Turkey also gets to benefit from the third-party free trade agreements that the EU negotiates with other countries, including the one that has just been struck with Canada. But Turkey does not get to be part of the trade negotiations themselves. It can only watch. Now, Turkey can negotiate its own free trade agreements with third countries, with, for example, Australia. However, if you're Australia, would you prefer to negotiate a free trade deal with Little Turkey or with the much more populous and lucrative European Union? Now, I want to talk about services, which are a major part of the UK economy. And it must be said that a lot of the free trade deals that the EU has negotiated recently, including the one with Canada, favour goods over services, which is a problem for the UK. Basically, goods are things you can hold in your hand or touch, like turnips or tables or cars, whereas services are actions like haircuts or something more ephemeral like education or a mortgage or financial advice. You can't really apply a tariff to a service, but you can grant a license to, say, a financial services company to operate in a certain country. Or you can apply what's called a non-tariff barrier, which is a non-financial instrument to limit trade in that service. So non-tariff barriers don't necessarily prevent trade in another country, but they make it harder. So, for example, in Germany, if you want to be a hairdresser, you have to pass a hairdressing exam that is in German, and you can only do it in Germany, which is hard if, say, you're Italian. I want to demonstrate that there's a real dichotomy with trade, which is that we want to trade with other countries, we want to make products easier to access, cheaper for the consumer, etc. But we also want to protect our own industries and our own interests at the same time. Now, for the purposes of the rest of the piece, I want to assume that we have left the EU with no deal and that we have wiped the slate clean, we only trade on WTO rules, and I think we'll start with this little analogy by talking about food. Now, in a no-deal scenario, we can import and export food in just the same way that we do now, the difference being that we will pay tariffs on a lot of that food, and some of those tariffs are quite high, so the cost of food may go up. But the issue about fresh food is more to do with customs delays. Now, those playing down the impact of a no-deal Brexit will tell you that we just open our borders. We don't charge customs, we don't check anything, and we don't charge tariffs as well, and that makes us very attractive. However, we can't rely on other countries to do the same for us. And this also touches on the import-export imbalance, which is what Trump is banging on about with China, that we can import as much as we like. That's not a problem. In fact, we are net importers of food, but we can't necessarily convince other countries to take our exports. And this leads me neatly into the concern that in order to strike beneficial trade deals with other countries, we might have to lower our standards and accept imports of products we don't really like chlorinated chicken. However, there's no impetus for you to buy them. And this leads me neatly into the concern that in order to strike beneficial trade deals with other countries, we might have to lower our standards and accept imports of products we don't really like chlorinated chicken. However, there's no impetus for you to buy them. What I'm trying to say is, even though the UK may find itself in a tougher trading position than it has done in the past 40 years, there's no impetus for us as consumers to buy products from X, Y, and Z. We can still keep our standards high. There's no one forcing you to buy chlorinated chicken. And I know people worry that the UK doesn't have enough to trade with the rest of the world, but remember that the City of London and our financial service industry remains the most desirable in the world. And, interestingly enough, so does our education system. Everyone wants a piece of that. And while we should be concerned that as net importers of food, that any drop in the value of the pound will make imports more expensive, remember that a drop in the pound will also make our exports more desirable. So there's always going to be winners and losers in this trade game, whatever happens.